It's not actually a celebrity chef with his slew of apprentices who changed the way most Americans cooked and ate. It was an earnest Bostonian named Fannie Farmer. So you guys are so smart. I know somebody here and will know the answer, many of you will. What is she holding in her hand? No, what do we remember? What's her big contribution? Do you know? Measuring. That is her little measuring cup. Ms. Farmer, taught at the Boston Cooking School, published a new edition of the school's cookbook in the 1890s. And this cookbook introduces the concept of systematic measurements. A half cup, a quarter cup, and level measurements, tablespoon, teaspoon, etc. She taught nutrition and cooking for the ill and infirm at Harvard Medical School. She was one of the only female professors where she was highly regarded. Although realistically, her students many of them were female nurses, so it was okay. But still, it was a big deal. She was recognized as a professional. Today, nutritionists point out that Farmer influenced American cooking in another way. Remember, she's teaching cooking for the ill and infirm. One of her goals is to get really sick people to eat. So what she does is she puts sugar in a whole lot of recipes that had never had sugar put in them before. So things like salad dressing. Today, when you go to the supermarket, right, you read the label and you think, sugar? Why is that right after oil? Why is there so much sugar in everything? I mean, savory items. It was Fannie Farmer is one of the reasons why Americans put so much sugar, because her traditional recipes added sugar where sugar had not been before. So items like sandwich bread might contain sugar today. That shows the influence of Fannie Farmer, who taught her students over 100 years ago that sweetened foods had a broader appeal. Now, when I was first writing this book, I planned to end it in 2000, the year 2000. But my editor at Source Books rejected that plan. She said, you can't write a book 1400 to 2000. It has to be 1400 to today. And I said, no, I'm an historian, and I really believe that current events are just a matter of opinion. If they're my opinion, I think it's right, but really, it's just my opinion. We don't have perspective on events within the age, or within the moment that we are living. At least that's my argument. And I lost. So I had to bring the book up to today, so that when she made it, she said, what if I call the, Today Show, and say, Libby can talk from about 1400 to 2000. No, you have to say, she can talk from then to today. So I was goner. I had to. The other thing I'm making fun of that, but the serious things are that I had to include 9/11. The story of 9/11 in my book, and just writing about that time in New York was a very difficult task. I was there when it happened. I lost a friend. It's not an easy topic for me to cover, and I didn't know how to approach it. But I'd left out an important American food, and I knew I had to include it, and that food was chili con carne. The first documented mention of chili con carne, red beans with spicy chilies and beef, comes from Texas, and is certainly associated with the Southwest and not with the American Southwest. It's not Mexican, it's Texan. In the late 1840s, America's boundaries spread across the continent, and chili con carne had its own sense of manifest destiny. This is the Polk administration, for those of you who know those things. Spreading, so chili is being spread sea to shining sea. It's really traveling. One reason why it's traveling is because outfitters figured out how to create chili bricks. You make chili, you dehydrate it. Some of you have had it, I'm sure. If anybody who grew up in the American Southwest who's over 40, this was sold in essentially like 7-Elevens or local groceries. And they were bricks of chili. You added water, you reconstituted it. It's instant food for cattle drives and also for wagon trains. So people would stock up on chili bricks, and that would be an emergency supply food. And that's one reason why I went out to California so quickly. It was still something that a lot of people had never eaten until the Great Columbia Exposition of 1893. That was an example of one of the world's fairs where so many foods were invented. You can just read, there's a whole book out there about food from fairs. And hot dogs on those rolls, that's what makes them hot dogs. That's also from that fair. Cracker Jacks were invented. What makes Cracker Jacks so unusual? It was the packaging. Nobody had figured out that if you used wax paper and then wrapped a box in foil, it would stay fresh and it wouldn't get all sticky. It could only, up until that time, only be sold locally. So that made it possible to ship Cracker Jacks in those individual servings. They put a toy in it, what they were inspired by the Quaker Oats people, who at that time were doing a promotion for Quaker Oats cereal, and they put a little toy in the Quaker Oats container, and the people who invented Cracker Jacks said, we'll do that too. And then they kept their toy in it, and that's how that started. It's all the same World's Fair, 1893, and there was a chili parlor at that fair, and it took off like the blazes, and it's an example of a food trend. We're used to the idea of food trends. You all laughed when we talked about kale. Can you remember when sushi first arrived? Sushi, are you kidding me? Raw fish? I'm not sure. And now everybody eats sushi. Chili is a great example of a food trend. 1890s, there were people eating chili all over the country in major metropolitan areas and small towns. And still today, a big pot of simmering chili feeds a hungry crowd of football fans, warms up a group of shivering skiers, and it can stay warm on a stove for hours. It's not surprising that it fits into the needs of a firehouse kitchen as well. And so chili gave me the idea I needed to tell the story of 9/11. I went to my favorite firehouse in New York City. It's a gorgeous Beaux-Arts building from 1899 down on Great Jones Street off Bowery. That used to be a bad part of town. For those of you who have not been to New York for 20 years, it is no longer a bad part of town, but it was one of the worst then a long time ago. I've always loved this architecture. 10 firefighters from this firehouse, which is home to Engine Company 33 and Ladder Company 9, are numbered among those who were lost on Tuesday, September 11th. And that's more than it's more than any other firehouse. They lost more people. A couple of those bronze plaques on the front mark their names. And we all know that plaques aren't enough. So one day, 2 springs ago, thanks to an introduction from some friends, I visited the firehouse, and I met with Lieutenant Brian Gamoka and a team of terrific firefighters on Great Jones Street. And I asked them if they would share their chili recipe. I'm telling the story of America through food, I said, and I want to tell your story too. So in the epilogue of the American Plate, I provide the origins of chili con carne, the history of the Great Jones Street Firehouse, and the recipe that Lieutenant Gamoka gave me for their own version of chili con carne. And let me tell you something, their chili recipe is really, really hot. So now I've given you my tour. I've brought you up to modern day. And a sense, I hope, of how food and foodways provide a unique window on American history. Thank you for traveling with me to the past, a different country with flavors of its own. And that's how you can contact me. But in the meantime, does anybody have any questions? Yes.
In addition to beaver tails, what are some of other foods that were once common but we wouldn't dream of eating today?
Well, a lot of them are dried meats. And it's interesting for me to see a revival of jerky in health food stores. But when you think about foods that we don't eat anymore, it's also often, like we are used to dried beans, green, like the kidney beans that you revive, but you would never eat dried green beans, right? But those were things, people had to preserve food for the winter. That was their biggest job. And some of those, the ways that people preserved things, like I wouldn't make an apple pie from dried apples unless I was recreating a traditional apple pie recipe. We have so much fresh food at our disposal that we don't think, oh, I'm gonna, eat this. There are other things like the way we cook doesn't, you have to use the techniques from long ago to get the best flavors from those foods. So things like mutton, you might not want to have it medium rare. But if you cook it a long time in a slow, well, today you could use a slow cooker. You could make it palatable. Really, they ate a lot more organ meats than we eat today. And I know that studies have shown that we have our diet is a lot less varied because we know what we like, we know what's easy to cook, and we're not eating, ham hocks because we might use them to flavor something. And they do add a wonderfully robust flavor. But that's not what if somebody comes over, we're not going to put a ham hock on their plate, even though it had been stewed. So I think it's largely in the meat area that you find things that you go, I'll tell you one. I actually don't mind eel. But if you say eel in a room of Americans, you're, oh my God, I live on Long Island. A lot of Italians, when we have on Christmas Eve, they have the seven fishes, right? Especially if they're Southern Italian. And one of the fishes is often eel, and of course, eel's not a fish, but that's just silly, but it's true. But if you go to the fish stores, just before Christmas Eve, you'll see eel being sold there. And when the Plymouth Plantation, when the first settlers arrived, they wrote home and said, we have to keep eating lobster. There's so much lobster, it just crawls up on the beach. Ugh. I have to eat one more lobster. They said the people are grumbling about the lobster. But then they found out that they could bait the weirs, the traps, with lobster and catch eels, and everybody was happy.
What is Madeira?
Madeira is a red wine that's been fortified with some brandy and heated. And it's essentially, they didn't think of it because they didn't know about this, but they were pasteurizing it. And it has a little bit, it's more like a sherry. So imagine a sherry, it's a fortified wine. The reason why it works so well for the colonists to be drinking Madeira is because it doesn't go bad. It can be shipped from Portugal, from the Madeira Islands, and it's in these big casks, and it weathers, it doesn't matter if it's hot weather or cold weather, whatever happens to it. You can get it you can get it over to the New World, and you bottle it at home, you serve it in a decanter to your friends, and it's good. They liked red wine too. Red wine would cost the same amount, but the chances of it going bad were much higher. So you had your choice. You could spend the equivalent of $40 a bottle. I mean, these wines were not being consumed by aspiring middle class. These were pretty elite people who were drinking this very much. They might, I don't want to give you the wrong impression. Lots of people drank this. But why spend $40 on a bottle of red wine that you weren't sure it was going to be good? Because if the weather was hot, wine can turn. Madeira will not turn. And it tastes great. Go and buy a bottle of Madeira. If you guys want to taste what 18th century food tastes like, make your favorite recipe for a stew or open a can of soup. And in that soup, add Madeira and allspice. Allspice is actually something from Jamaica. It is a native to the New World, not to continental United States, but it is for the New World. And those two flavors are really, I think, the type of taste that anybody from the 18th century would recognize as, oh, this tastes, like food that I eat. Another flavor that they ate a lot was mace, which is a different from a nutmeg plant, but it's from a different part of the nutmeg plant. You can buy that. You have to order it often online. If you go to a special spice shop, sometimes they don't sell it. In New York, I've only been able to get it online. Yes.
Are chili bricks still available?
You know what? I gave one of these talks and mentioned this story, and there was a woman who had grown up a young woman who had grown up near an Indian reservation. And she said at the trading post you could still buy chili bricks when she was growing up. You might be able to find them. I haven't gone to look.
I grew up in Southern California.
Okay.
We used chili bricks were available in any market.
Yeah.
We used them as the base for our chili con carne. And then you spun off that to make
Sure.
your own recipe.
Right, and you'd add meat yourself. You
and
wouldn't
they made
just.
a wonderful base, but I've never seen them on the East Coast, and I was recently in Southern California and looked and did not see them in the markets. So I thought you might know.
All I've heard is that they're not. It hasn't been that long. I mean, people have said, I saw that just a few years ago, have not seen it since. But I bet you could find them you could find them on Trading Posts at places. You know what, I have to move my locale. I'll answer your, I thought I saw a hand up over here. No, yeah.
Wild rice, was that native
Yes.
to North America?
Yes, and it still is harvested by Native Americans up in the Great Lakes area. It's a very, very nourishing grain. It's a grain similar to rice, but it's not a close relative of rice. And it has making a rebound today. You see it in more places. It's a delicious grain and very nourishing as well.
You showed the photograph of Promontory Point in Utah with the,
Yeah.
but you didn't mention what the different foods might have been eaten by
Yeah.
the Irish who were
Okay.
west. And the,
Okay. That's a good question. So, do you want me to? I will. Okay. So this is a really, I think, a very, very interesting story. At first, there are two groups of workers, right? One's coming from the Middle West going up to Utah, and the other's coming across from California. In terms of miles, not as far from California, but it's much harder work. The guys who were hiring workers in California included Chinese laborers as part of their working teams, and the Irish immigrants, who were largely the workers on the other teams, were very angry and said they did not want to work with the Chinese. But in this case, the railroad companies said, too bad, you're going to have to work with the Chinese. But don't worry, because we're not going to pay them the same salary we pay you, and we're not going to give them the food that we give you. So the Chinese had to provide their own food while they were working for the railroad companies. And the Irish had to eat the food that the railroad companies gave them. And guess who was a lot healthier at the end of the day? And it's really a horrible story, really, when you think about it. The Irish suffered, well, first of all, they found the Chinese crazy because they bathed every day, and they drank water that had been boiled. Even if it was coming from a stream, the Chinese would boil it. They didn't always have tea leaves to make tea, but they would boil the water at night, and then they would have it and bring it with them and cool during the day. The Europeans would just drink that. They'd say, oh, this is just a mountain stream, no problem. But hundreds of men were camped around there. They were eating salt beef and potatoes. That's actually something that the workmen liked to eat, but it's not a very good diet. And the Chinese, meanwhile, had traveled with a lot of dried food. So they had dried shrimp. You know, you get them in Chinese markets. Dried shrimp, they had dried noodles, they had dried beans, and including dried green beans, things that we would think, looks just so unappetizing, but it was a very healthy diet, and they had a cook that traveled with them. So they ended up having a much better rate of
Survival.
not just survival, health. I mean, they were healthy during this process, whereas the immigrants, most of them were Irish, but there were Germans, there were some Italian, they were from all over Europe. And they suffered from dysentery, they would get infections, they had all sorts of nutritional problems because the railroad companies promised to feed them, and of course fed them the cheapest food. They fed them food that only 10 years earlier would have just been given to slaves.
Thanksgiving's around the corner.
Yeah.
First meal, first Thanksgiving, and the origin of the word turkey.
Turkey. Turkey, I'm going to start with that because most people don't know that story. Turkeys came to Great Britain before the Mayflower set sail. Okay, the Mayflower set sail in 1620. Turkeys were brought over by Columbus to Europe, and they actually were very popular early on in around the Mediterranean. And that's where the Spanish were doing a lot of their trading. so the boats arrive from the Mediterranean area, and they go to London, and they're carrying turkeys. And the way historians understand what happened is that they think that the British looked at them and said, well, they're from Turkey. Because we know it's the same word. They believed that was called a turkey bird, because they thought that the sailors were from Turkey. They didn't understand, how that all works. Maybe some of the sailors were from Turkey. But if you think about it, the French call turkeys dinde, which means from India, right? It comes D''IND, not the West Indies, but from India. Nobody really knows where these birds are from. And when the guys come over, the early settlers come over, and they find wild turkeys in the New World, they think, wow, how'd those get here? They never put it together. But turkeys domesticate very easily, and they herd very easily. So it's actually pretty easy to have, if you're a small farmer in Britain, it's easy to have a few dozen turkeys that you can bring to market. You can herd them to market, and that certainly was something that happened here in the New World by the 18th century. There were big flocks of turkeys that people could herd. It was a task for children to bring them to market. Thanksgiving, origin of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is a harvest festival. The first Thanksgiving, 1621, October, they never said this was a Thanksgiving. They said, our harvest being gotten in, several men went out to get fowl, and they brought in enough to feed us for 2 weeks. So they had a lot of food on their hand. These were people who had been starving. Many, many people, half of their population had died. There were 102 people that arrived, and by the end of the winter, there were only 51 left. Pretty much evenly split between Episcopalians, Anglicans, and the Pilgrim separatists, all right? So different types of people, but they're living together. They have thanks to the Wampanoags, they learn how to farm the soil and grow the corn and squash and beans. They understand how to get the fish and the eel and the lobster. But they're huge numbers. It's very easy to go hunting back then. I mean, all you had to do was shoot into the sky, because there were so many birds flying overhead that it would darken the sky. So we know they had a feast. We know they were not expecting the Wampanoags to visit, but they were doing target practice, which is a traditional thing to do when people would get together in 17th century. They would have target practice, and they would run races, and they'd do things. The Native Americans heard the sound of the guns going off. They came to investigate, and they saw they were having a party. You didn't invite us. So pretty soon, a whole bunch of warriors come with Massasoit, and they're bringing deer. And so they bring venison for everyone. So the one thing we know that they ate at the first, what we call Thanksgiving, but what they would have called a harvest festival or a gathering, was venison. And they also had fowl on the table. One of those may have been a turkey. They probably did not have cranberry sauce, because that has to be very sweet. Cranberries are so sour. And pumpkin pie, they did not have the ingredients to make crust, but they may have made some sort of pumpkin dessert sweetened with maple syrup.
When does cheese become a regular
Cheese.
part of the early American diet?
As soon as they bring dairy animals over, they're eating cheese. I don't know any European culture that doesn't have cheese. But there's no cheese here until the Europeans arrive. So queso is from Spanish dairy practices, the fresh cheese that you get in Mexican food.
I was curious more about, is it more goat and sheep, because that's more easily handled than the larger beasts of the field?
I've seen records of all of that, but I see a lot more goat cheese than sheep cheese. And partially because of the size of goats makes them easier just to, the young women did dairy. But remember also, the cows back then were smaller. The cows that are being brought over in the 17th century, I know because I milked one. It was a Red Devon. It's a heritage breed. They backbreed them now. So if you go to places like Williamsburg, you'll see these little cows. They're really very sweet-tempered, and they are very good at producing very rich milk. So much higher butterfat content than a Holstein, which has been bred to be a dairy cow. I mean, they have huge udders. They're these little they're like a Guernsey or a Jersey cow. They're small. So the What's interesting to me is that you'll find people really locally famous or well-known in their community for being the good cheesemaker, just like people are good beer brewers. And Vermont early on is a big center for cheese. When Jefferson is elected, his supporters in Vermont bring down a giant cheese ball. And that happened with Andrew Jackson as well. And apparently it took months for the White House to stop smelling like cheese. Mary.
This will be the last question.
Okay, this will be the last question, I've been told.
Okay, to bring this up to the present, could you
To
talk
today.
a little bit to today about your views about genetically modified foods?
Oh, thanks. Sure. Well, here I am. This is just an opinion, all right? Because it's but I am in favor of labeling. I think an educated consumer is a good consumer. I also believe that GMO foods are in our marketplace already. We are already eating that. This is not to say I'm in favor of it, but it's going on. One thing to remember, I personally would rather avoid GMO food. But there are situations like in Southeast Asia where you have extreme deficiencies in vitamin A, where 500,000 children are going blind every year because they don't have enough vitamin A in their diet. They're eating a rice-based diet. They don't have enough orange vegetables. It's not so easy to convert a family that's used to raising rice to making them grow yams and carrots. You can try, but they get cash for their rice. That's what they want for their family. So scientists have created a GMO rice that has vitamin A added to it. It's called golden rice. It is making a huge difference. If I was a mother in Southeast Asia and I had a choice, GMO foods and my children seeing, or GMO foods and maybe one of my children going blind, that's not a choice. So before we say end all GMO foods, remember this is a complicated issue. And it's easy for me to say, I don't want that in my kitchen. But for other people, it may be the answer between a life expectancy of 45 and a life expectancy of 55.
Is it the problem with the way they raise the GMO food, with the herbicides and pesticides and things?
No, it's not. Actually, that's a problem too. And then that's a problem because you have that, even if you're an organic farmer, if you're next to a farmer that's using a lot of pesticides, there's a lot of, the breeze blows it back and forth. It's very difficult, hard on the workers too, but it does make our food more expensive, so there are balances there. The GMO food is food that has been genetically engineered. And the danger in that is that the seeds from those plants can escape and grow elsewhere. And you might not want to lose those potatoes that have been perfectly good for centuries. Might not want that breed of potatoes to start having genes that were introduced from fish so that they could live better in a rainy climate. You might not want that.
Okay, thank you so much.
That was a long question. Oh.